Recently, the allure of backcountry skiing has become stronger and stronger with you. Yet, when you go to look at the gear, you're not 100% sure in what direction you want to go in. Well, in today's video, we are going to be covering different setups that will allow you to meet your touring needs. What's going on, everybody? Welcome to Mountain Vibes. Thank you so much for tuning in today. And if this is your first time here, consider hitting that subscribe button. That way you're not going to miss any future release content here on the channel. So in today's video, we're going to be covering both the boots and the bindings for a ski touring backcountry setup, or an AT setup, or a slack country setup. Whatever you want to call it, the type of setup that you will need to allow you to go beyond the boundaries of a ski resort and really allow you to explore what the mountains around you have to offer. Keep in mind though, I will not be doing a huge tech deep dive into each individual piece, and really just more or less be discussing different types of levels or different types of setups for individuals with different goals, different needs, and different budgets. So without wasting any more time, let's get into this video, shall we? First setup that we're looking at today is going to be the frame setup, or the frame binding. Now, the great thing about getting a setup like this is that you do not need to go out and get a specific boot in order to access the functionality of this setup. Pretty much these types of bindings will accommodate any boot on the market, well, with a very small exception of some of them, which will be discussed later on in the video. Now, what happens here is that this is what's giving you your range of motion. Once this is actually mounted on your ski and it's released on the heel end of the binding, because this is all attached by a single frame, and then once you move, this is what's giving you your range of motion. This is what's going to allow you to skin or climb uphill. As well, a binding like this, because it is essentially a traditional alpine binding on a frame, this will work as a very good inbound setup as well. So if you're someone who doesn't necessarily want to have to go and buy a brand new boot just to start putting a touring kit together, and you don't want necessarily have to make an entirely second kit, get yourself a frame binding, because this is going to allow you to ski both inbounds and giving you backcountry uphill capability. At the same time though, keep in mind that these are fairly heavy, as you can tell by the sheer size of it. So when you actually are touring, you actually have to pull the whole binding up with you. It's not just your boot that's going to be moving. As well, when you are skiing, it does create a bit of a dead spot in between the bindings because of the nature of this binding, with it being attached by one huge frame. But for many of you, you probably won't necessarily feel like, the dead spot in your skis. Another thing to keep in mind though too, because you are moving this up and down while you are walking or touring, the frame may tweak and bend a little bit. So just be a little bit careful when you are actually looking into a binding like this. There aren't as many options as there used to be several years ago, but manufacturers are still making them just for the ability of people wanting to get into touring without having to go out and spend a bunch of money on getting a new boot. The second setup we're looking at today is the hybrid setup. Now, the biggest fundamental difference between these setups now and compared to the frame setup that we looked at previous is that now you need to get a specific boot that will in fact be compatible with pin bindings. The reason for this is that now all of the toe pieces on these bindings are in fact pin toes, and therefore you're going to need to find yourself a very specific boot or style of boot that will allow to accommodate for you to use these as a touring setup. Luckily, nowadays, a lot of manufacturers are getting more into the hybrid or free ride category. So many of the boots will look very similar to this one here. And the way to tell that if it's pin compatible or not, you will see these tech inserts actually built right into the boot itself, along with having a tech insert in the back. Another great thing with having a hybrid boot or a free ride boot similar to this is that these boots are now compatible with pretty much any binding on the market. So if you're someone who's like actually looking to, let's say, get a little bit more serious into touring, or you want to kind of get a brand new kit, start from scratch, I would highly suggest getting a free ride boot or a hybrid boot similar to this. Another great thing with what they'll have a walk mode, which will unhinge and allowing the upper cuff to move a lot more freely, giving you a much better uphill experience. Now, at the same time though, these boots, with them being designed with a little bit more downhill in mind, they are going to be heavier in comparison to, let's say, a more true touring boot. But having said that though, if you're someone who doesn't necessarily want to have them go out and buy two boots, if you're comfortable with carrying a little bit more extra weight around, going for a hybrid boot will be your best option. And the great thing about them too is because they're now pin compatible, when they actually click in, there is no extra frame or heel piece that you'll be lifting, because with it being attached by the pins, it's just the boot that moves. It's going to make your experience going uphill a lot better. Now, when it comes to the bindings, there is a few different routes in which you can go. The one that I've gone with is called the Kingpin. So this is a little bit lighter at the front because it is only a pin toe piece. But because when it comes to the heels, it's a little bit burlier. It's going to give me a little bit more security because it will release a little bit more accurately compared to, let's say, a more pin compatible or a more tech oriented binding. Now, as well, there's two other ones out on the market. These are going to be more, I guess you would consider as a true hybrid, because what they do is they actually have more of a traditional looking toe piece, but what happens is they'll actually, in a sense, transform into an actual pin compatible binding. So with this one here, this is the Duke PT for marker. As you can see, it just flicked up and revealing the pins on the binding. You can take this off, make it a little bit lighter if you wanted to. And then the heel piece is going to be very similar to something like this, giving it more of a traditional feel, giving you a lot more security. The other binding that's available is the Solomon Shift, which is quite popular. Very similar layout, allowing you to use it not only as a pin binding, making it a lot easier going uphill, but it's going to be able to give you a lot more security by turning the front into more of a traditional toe piece. Now, as I mentioned, in order to make these work, you do need to buy a specific boot. So if you are someone who is willing to start from scratch or is willing to make a brand new kit, this is a very good option for you. Keep in mind though too, yes, this still is not going to be the lightest option available. A lot of these hybrid bindings are still quite heavy. But if you are an individual who wants literally one kit to do it all, this is pretty much going to be the best option for you. Keep in mind, you will have to spend a little bit more money compared to the original setup with just the frame binding. The last setup we're looking at today is the full-on tech setup or lightweight setup. Now, this setup is going to be the most specific of the three that we've looked at, mainly because of the way that the boots are designed. Yes, super lightweight in nature, but these can only be used with a full-on pin binding. Biggest reason for this is with the way that the ends are actually designed, they're actually not long enough for them to actually step into a traditional alpine binding or even a hybrid binding for that matter. Many of them as well have full-on rubberized rockered soles, and because of this actual shape, they will not actually step into a proper alpine binding. The great thing about a boot like this is that it's super lightweight. So if you're someone who goes on, like say, longer traverses or multi-day tours, this is going to be a great option for you. Tons of range of motion. It's going to make walking around in them, if you have to do any sort of mountaineering or hiking, going to make it very, very easy for you. Just the one downside is that they don't necessarily provide the best downhill ski performance. But if you're someone who's going to be focusing more on the traverse and more of the touring aspect, this is going to be the best option for you. Now, moving on to the bindings, as I mentioned, that these types of boots can only work with a full-on pin binding. This is going to be the lightest weight option of everything that we've been looking at today. The one drawback to it is that they don't necessarily release the greatest. So if you are someone who's looking to get into a setup like this, I would highly recommend that this be your second setup. I don't necessarily recommend that this be your one and only. Biggest reason is that a lot of these pins aren't necessarily designed to take the punishment for everyday inbound resort use. They don't necessarily release the greatest, or they're not most reliable when it comes to releasing. So just be very, very careful when you're actually wanting to ski a setup like this. So a lot of the lightweight ones are going to be more tailored to people who are looking for longer hikes or like longer traverses, multi-day tours, and they don't necessarily want to have to carry around a bunch of extra weight as far as their kit is concerned. So having said that, that's what that's going to be tailored towards. You know, if you are someone who is taking it a little bit more seriously, but not quite as serious, but you still want better performance for both downhill and uphill, go for that hybrid setup that we mentioned earlier. And as well, if you are an individual who just kind of wants to experience touring, but you don't necessarily want to go and either create yourself a brand new kit, go for that frame binding that I mentioned earlier in the video. So that's it for me for today, everybody. Hopefully you got something out of this video. If you have any questions, please feel free to leave them down in the comments section below. I'll be happy to get back to you as soon as I can. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up. It would be greatly appreciated. Subscribe if you are not already. Support your local ski and snowboard shop. Thank you very much for tuning in today. See you guys in the next video.